In the last few years, it has become incredibly clear that China is resorting to the gossip girl method of making friends by buying them. But instead of sending their buddies something cool like a vintage name brand item or a cool car, China is instead gifting their friends on the African continent entire government buildings. For example, just a few months ago, Zimbabwe announced that they were near finishing their $140 million parliamentary building built by China. But Zimbabwe isn't the only one finding themselves with a new government building or infrastructure loan thanks to China. Other countries, including Botswana, Malawi, Somalia, and many others, have found themselves on the receiving end of such Chinese deals in what is now being known as palace diplomacy. But it goes farther than just government buildings and parliamentary offices. This is just one part of China's $4 trillion Belt and Road Initiative, a goal to give infrastructure loans to developing countries, including things such as airports, roads, bridges, ports, so on and so forth. But many analysts are concerned that these short-term benefits might be outweighed by long-term implications. And because it's for the future economic development of dozens of African nations, we need to ask ourselves today's question of what will be the long-term implications of China's palace diplomacy on the African continent. And the answer is that it's going to create significant long-term woes in three key areas. First, regarding reliance and leverage. Second, security concerns. And third and finally, regarding debt trap diplomacy. But first, it's important that we take a look at reliance and leverage and understand just how critical this is for the future of palace diplomacy. Because understand that when China provides a loan or a different kind of diplomacy through this initiative, it doesn't have the same sort of economic planning and future development inherent aspects that other Western groups include when they create such an infrastructure initiative. Things such as economic development or plans for how to pay for this infrastructure in the future. Because what happens when those roads crumble, the bridges fall, and that shiny new government building needs some upgrades? The answer is that you have to turn back to that initial source of income. And what does that create? Reliance. And this is something that China has not been shy about capitalizing on. As explained in an article posted by the Brookings Institution on September 22nd of 2022, China utilizes these friendships that they developed through palace diplomacy in order to gain African countries' votes in organizations such as the UN. And we saw this specifically with COVID-19. Because, as explained this time in an article posted by the Center for Strategic and International Studies on October 1st of 2022, that when China faced heat from organizations like the UN and the World Health Organization, who did they turn to for support? Sub-Saharan African nations who they had bought with this diplomacy policy and who were now reliant on them. Even when those countries could have used that platform in order to vie for things that they desperately needed during COVID. Things like maybe vaccines to help their populations. But no, they were reliant and inextricably tied to China, leaving them with their hands tied. Which is the first long-term implication of China's palace diplomacy. But second, it's important that we take a look at security concerns, because economic issues aren't the only ones tied to the palace diplomacy. Because who builds these large government buildings and other forms of infrastructure? Chinese companies. While it would be great of them to outsource the projects to companies within these countries in order to grow their economics, this isn't what happens. Chinese companies like Huawei, for example, supply the technology for many of these countries and their government buildings. But why does this matter? As explained in an article posted by Reuters on August 2nd of 2022 goes on to state that if Huawei, for example, as a company resonates with you, it's probably because you heard about them about 4 years ago for getting kicked out of the United States for trying to steal government information. And this is a major concern specifically within the African corridor of the Belt and Road Initiative, because Huawei technologies and different Chinese-based technology companies are utilized as the main method of providing internet and other services to these countries. And when that happens, their technology becomes vulnerable, not only to Chinese intellectual property theft, but cyber attacks and other information grabbing that could harm them in the future, which is why we see this as the second long-term implication of China's palace diplomacy. But third, and possibly most importantly, we need to take a look at debt trap diplomacy, because these countries weren't chosen at random. It's no coincidence that 40 out of 140 memorandums of understanding or loan agreements that China has dealt out in the BRI has been to sub-Saharan African nations, because they prey on those who will likely be too weak to pay them back. Because while China may phrase these as gifts, they're largely anything but. Many of those government office buildings and other forms of infrastructure were given, but with terms of payback, low interest loans that eventually will have the bill run due. But what happens when they do? China executes debt for equity swaps if a country is not able to pay them back. It's no coincidence that China's only overseas military base is in Djibouti, on the Horn of Africa. That country built a military base with their Chinese loan, and when they couldn't pay China back, China retook over the infrastructure, leaving Djibouti in debt to China and without the infrastructure they'd originally tried to build. It's a lose-win situation, and I think we can all see who's winning, which is why we have to understand this as a key long-term consequence of China's palace diplomacy, the potential of having a debt for equity swap and losing that infrastructure forever. So when we look back at my question today, of what will be the long-term implications of China's palace diplomacy on the African continent, and the answer is that they will have reliance and leverage with China. Second, because of security concerns. And third and finally, debt trap diplomacy. And while Gossip Girl may be a great show, we can't have our loans basing on their ideals.